Hey guys, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to improve the look of poor fitting clothing using Photoshop. Now this is something I do a lot, particularly when I'm photographing guys in poor fitting suits. So often they might button up but then they're gaping down the bottom, and this looks really untidy, particularly if they're wearing a light shirt. You can also use it for dress malfunctions where you might have a poor fitting dress and it shows a little bit of extra cleavage or just areas that shouldn't be showing. This technique will work just as well. So with this tutorial, we're going to start with, I'll show you how to put in a realistic shadow, cut out the clothing, and then we're even going to add a few little extras like add the button back in, including the shadow, and then also just finish the image off. So let's have a look at how to do that now. All right, so I've got my image opened in Photoshop. Here's the edit here. I just want to quickly show you the different layers. So firstly, I darkened that shirt area because of course when we've got the jacket coming over the top here, the light isn't going to be getting into that area, so it's important that I darken it first. Then I'll show you how to mask out and duplicate that fabric. I've also removed the button and replaced it with a new button, including the new drop shadow, so I'll show you how to do that. I've also warped this fabric. I'll show you how to do that. And then finally we add a curves adjustment layer over the top. All right, so let me just bring this edit underneath now, and we'll start with the original layer, and this is a raw file. Okay, so first thing is I want to duplicate this area. So you can see where the hand is. The light is coming from camera right, camera left. This is a 5 light setup I've got here to create the white background, and so you can see where the shadow is. So I want to duplicate that all the way down that shirt, and the way that I do that is with my background layer selected. I'm going to come down here to my adjustment layers and I'm going to add a new curves adjustment layer. Now rather than guessing how I want to darken it, I know that I want to darken it, so you can come in here and there are actually default settings, and the one that says darker usually does the trick. So problem is I've darkened my overall image. I only want to darken this area. So the workaround is with my layer mask selected, I'm going to actually invert or hide the adjustment that I've just done. And so in order to do that, it's Command I on the keyboard, and that will invert the layer mask. So I've just hidden it. Now if I want to reveal the adjustment, the darkening that I've just done to this overall image, all I need to do is get a nice soft brush, so 0 hardness, and I want to have white as my foreground color. And now with my mask selected on my curves adjustment layer, I can come in and I'll bring my flow down to around 25%. Make sure opacity is 100%. Make my brush a little bit bigger. Whoops, just zoom in, and I'm just going to brush over that area. And you can see I'm just actually following the line of the jacket. So you can see that that's the original shadow, and I'm just going to darken this area so that it looks a little bit more believable when I move the fabric over the top. All right, so that's that done. So you can see before and after, I've created a nice little shadow there. Next thing I want to do is I need to cut out and duplicate this fabric here, and I'm going to move it across and make it look like it realistically belongs to this jacket. So in order to do that, now there's a couple of ways you can do that, and there is, like, I could select one of my selection tools and cut the area out and then select and mask it, and so the tool I like to use, there's a couple of tools. If I was still a beginner, I believe that the pen tool, even though it feels like it's slower, it is the quickest and easiest way for a beginner to cut out a subject, particularly if it's low contrast like this area, so lots of greys and blacks. The automated selection tools in Photoshop really still struggle with that area. So I find that just coming in and using the pen tool, particularly if you're a learner, is a really precise way of accurately cutting out images. And you can see that I'm not quite getting it even, but I can fix that with a layer mask. So I just go around as quickly as I can, and I'm going to go up here. I don't want the pocket, and I'm going to come up to here, avoiding the sleeve. I want to cut around the hands because I don't need that, and make sure that I miss the hands altogether. All right, so I've got my path selected and it's all joined up. Now, if I right click on any one of those anchor points, I can now make a selection. And so you'll get a little dialog box that asks you if you want to feather the selection. I don't usually just stick to the default settings, new selection, and hit OK. All right, so I've now got my selection of this area of clothing. And now what I need to do is put that up onto its own layer. And the shortcut for that is Command J. And there you can see that I've got my new layer of fabric. So I can hit the Move tool, make sure that that layer is selected, and I can move that around wherever I want to. All right, so what I'm also going to do is make sure that this curves adjustment layer is actually under that fabric. All right, so now when I move it over, it's not going to affect that new shadow that I put there. All right, so next thing we want to do is move this clothing into place and position it in such a way that a couple of things I'm conscious of here. I want to make sure that all these little lines match up, because and if you don't have a checked or just have a plain suit, you'll have a much easier job. But I want to make sure that the squares add up. So the best way to do that is just with that layer selected, just knock back the opacity, and basically what you can do is you can get it in the ballpark, and then you want to make sure that you've got your suit closing up. So I think I've gone a little bit too far there, so probably about here looks good. And now I just want to line up my little checks. So I can get them in the ballpark, which is probably about there. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, so they all fit in there. And I've got my jacket coming in and it's covering up nicely. So, and then if you want to make, so I'm just using my mouse to move across. But if you want to make more precise movements, what I find is really helpful is just use the up or down or side keys on the keyboard, and you can nudge in at 1 pixel at a time, and it's a really good way to line up things precisely, because sometimes I feel like I'm going crazy and I keep missing or going over the mark. So that's a good little way, just using the up, down, side keys on the keyboard, and you can nudge. You don't have to be 100% precise, but you want to be in the ballpark, particularly if you've got checks and things like that. So I'll bring my opacity back up, And so that's looking all right. So now, a couple of things. I want to make sure that it's nicely lined up down the bottom, and that is pretty good because we can get rid of some of this extra fabric here. So just making sure that it's following the line. And if you have a look, I'm just going to put another layer here and show you what I mean. We'll just get a nice red. If you have a look, the lining of the jacket is coming down, and the original jacket comes down something like this. All right, to make sense. Now, at the moment, we've got it going that way. And so I want to push it in so that it's going that way. The best way to do that is to transform this layer. So I've got my clothing layer selected, and I'll just rename that so you know what I'm working with, clothing. Okay. So what you need to do is come to Edit, Transform, and it's this one here, Warp. Now you can see the little dialog box comes up, and you've got these extra little handles here. And what happens is I can move one of the handles and it's going to move my fabric. Now, one thing I want you to notice is that as I'm doing that, notice how the button, when I move, the button is going to distort, and so that's not going to be good. So before I do that, what I want to do is I'm going to remove this button from this location, but before I do that, I want to make a copy of it. So in order to do that, I'm just going to come around and make a selection. Now you might want to be a little bit more precise. Actually, I'm just going to make a bigger selection here, and I'm going to include the shadow, and hopefully I'll be able to use that in my edit. So once I've got the selection, again, Command J, and now I've got the button up on its own layer there. Okay, so I'm just going to save that for later on. So we'll call that button. All right, so back to, we'll turn that off for now. We don't need it. So back to our original layer. What I need to do is now remove this button because it's not going to make sense. Once I warp the jacket, it's not going to be in the right place. So the best way to do this is to use something called Content Aware Fill. So what I'm going to do is, again, select my circular marquee tool and make a selection around the button. Okay, making sure that I'm getting the whole button. And then what I'm going to do is come down to Edit, Content Aware Fill, and then you get a little dialog box that comes in. Now, if you haven't worked with this tool before, there are 2 detailed tutorials on how to work with this tool. It is sensational, particularly in the new updated versions of Photoshop. So if you want a slower run through, then I suggest you check back and have a look at those tutorials. If you're following along, then basically you'll get a little dialog box here, and this dialog box shows you the final edit. The original dialog box is where you need to tell Photoshop the area that you want to copy to replace this button. And so what I do is just with my cursor, and I've got the brush tool selected, I'm going to go around my selection. Basically, and you can see how it's updating there, what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, Photoshop, this is the area of fabric I want you to do to clone and replace my button. So you can see that it's done a great job in the middle, but it's not getting rid of the shadow. So what I'm going to do is come back and actually make a larger selection and include more of the shadow, and that's going to give Photoshop a much better way of filling in that area. So when it comes to anything that's automated, it's as good as you are at telling it what you want it to do. So if you make a poor selection, Photoshop is going to give you a poor outcome. So let's try again now. So I've got my area selected. I'm going to come to Edit, Content Aware Fill. And again, here we go. I'm going to select the area that I want Photoshop to use to fill in the button. And there we go. We got a much better result this time. Okay, so just give it another go, and that looks pretty good. So I'm going to hit OK. Okay, so now I've got, turn that off. That little area has been filled in nicely. So what I'm going to do now is just merge those two areas together. So I've got the area that the patch that goes over the button and the area of clothing. If I right click on that, merge layers, that combines those two layers. So now it's just one layer without the button, and I've got my button selection there. So now let's go back to using Puppet Warp to improve the fit and look of this selection. So I've got a blank document here. Now if I turn my flow and opacity up to 100%, I've got a nice red color selected. I've got my brush tool. Let's have a look at if I do a brush stroke at 0% hardness. So it's got a lovely feather on it. That's what it looks like. And so if I come in nice and close, you can see that it's not a hard edge. It's a very soft edge. Now, if I turn my hardness to 50%, okay, let's do another stroke there. Now you can see that it's not as feathered, and you're getting a cleaner line, but it's still got some softness around the edges. And now if I go to 100% hardness and do that again, you can see that I've got a jagged, a hard edge there. So that's important to note because it's going to make a huge difference to how you edit your files. So let's go back to our original image. So I'm looking at the fingers here, and the edge isn't a completely hard edge like at 100%. It's probably around 40 or 50%. So I want to match my brush edge to give me a more accurate cutout. Let me just undo what I just did there. So I'll come down and I'm going to make my brush about 40% hardness. And now I've got my layer, the clothing layer selected, and I've got my layer mask selected. I'm going to make black as my foreground color, and wherever I brush with black is going to remove that fabric. Now let's just say I make a mistake and I go too far. I can just switch back to white as my foreground color, and I can bring back whatever I want to. So this is the beauty of working with layer masks. It's non-destructive. So whenever you make a mistake, just swap the colors and bring it back. So black as my foreground color. I'll do the easy bits first. I'll get almost to the edge, but not quite. And then what I'm going to do to make it easier for me to see what I'm doing is I'll drop the opacity of this layer, and now I can actually just come in and accurately cut out. I'll just bring it up a little bit more so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, that's the layer there. And so I'm just following along the lines of the fingers there. All right, and just removing that fabric. All right, so if I bring up the opacity, that looks pretty good. And you can see that just that simple act of matching the edge of the brush with the edge that you're trying to mask out really makes life easier. So let's have a look now, before and after. All right, it's looking pretty good, but we've got a bit of a mess to clean up here. You can see that while the pattern lines up here, it's not lining up here and also here. So I'm going to come back, make sure that I've got the layer, not the layer mask, but the actual layer selected, and come back to Edit, Transform, Warp, and I'm just going to clean up. So you don't actually need to use these handles. You can just come to the actual part of the image, and I'm just going to try and just give this a little bit of a warp here. And just try and get it all back into place. All right, just tweaking that a little bit. All right, that looks better now. Okay, so I've got everything lined up except possibly for this little part here. So just tweak that a little bit. So I'm just trying to line this one up here. And of course, in doing so, I'm going to mess up my layer mask. But we can come back and fix that. So I've got my, yep, that's looking better. So hit OK. And then I'm going to come back to my layer mask and clean up this mess that I've just made. So I've got the layer mask selected, black as the foreground color. Just come back in, get as close as you can, and then drop the opacity and just clean up the fingers there. Bring the opacity back. All right, that looks pretty good. Just clean up the edges. Okay, and while I have that, I'm going to make my brush super small and just get rid of the white edges on the mask here. So this is just for the areas where the little bit of shirt is poking through from the original cutout. And this, believe it or not, is how I refine my selections in Photoshop. I prefer this over using the auto select or tools, because particularly if you're using a low contrast subject, I actually find that this is much faster. All right, so just a little area there. All right, that's a couple more grains. There you go. All right, so we've got before and after. That's all looking good. We've got these edges that we need to clean up, and there's also this little patch here that I just want to fill in. So what I can do is create a new empty layer, and this is what you'll find that you'll have to contend with as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, with this layer selected and little rectangle marquee tool, I'm actually just going to cut out a little patch about this big. I've got my selection, Command J, duplicated onto its own layer. So if I now hit the move tool, make sure that the layer is selected, I can now move this little patch just into here to fill in that little area. And again, layer mask, and just cutting out where the fingers are. Drop down the opacity, clean it up a bit quicker. All right, so just cleaning those edges. So it can be a bit fiddly, but it is worth it. All right, so just bring up the opacity and clean up any little areas there. All right, so before and after, and you can see that it actually is too light for that area. So what I want to do is blend it in. So what I'm going to do is create a new brightness contrast adjustment layer, and just go back, and I'm going to clip that to the layer underneath, because at the moment, if I adjust anything, it's going to adjust the overall subject. That's not what I want. I just want it to apply to this little patch, that little patch there. I just want those adjustments to apply to that. So what I'm going to do is, if you hover your mouse in between the two layers and hold the Option key on a Mac, Alt on a Windows, it's going to clip that brightness contrast adjustment layer to that little piece of fabric, the layer underneath. So now that that's clipped, I can make any adjustments, and it's only going to affect that little bit of fabric. All right, so if I zoom in, I'm just going to scooch it across until it blends in, which is about there. That looks pretty good. Before, after. So it's nicely blended in. Okay, so I've successfully patched up the jacket. Now I'm going to take care of these gnarly lines here where you can see the edge of my cutout. So coming back to my clothing layer, and this is why if this is all kind of new to you, it's a good idea to keep all your layers labeled and organized. So I can come down to my clothing layer, make sure I've got my layer mask selected. I'm going to now come in and make my brush 0 hardness. So I do want a nice soft edge, and I'm actually going to bring my flow down to about 10%. So essentially what I'm doing is softening these edges just by removing them, going over the edges with a soft brush with the layer mask selected. Black is my foreground color. So black takes away, okay, and white brings back. And so if I just go around those edges, I'm sort of just blending them in, really. All right, and I just might make my brush a little bit bigger. So just blending those areas in. So we just get rid of those telltale edges there. And just down here. All right, let's have a look. And that has pretty much, make a mistake. Make sure that white is the foreground color, and I can just come back and bring that back in. Okay, that is the beauty of the layer mask. All right, so that is starting to look pretty good. I just want to clean up this little top area here. Just remove that a little bit. That's looking pretty good. Now remember the button, we can now replace it. So before I do that, I'm just going to go back and check where the original one was. Okay, and so I'll bring in my new button, and that should be a good match. So let's just bring all our layers back, and I'm just going to select that button and just move it across a fraction. And basically, there's the other buttonhole there, so I want them to line up. So about there looks good. Now, where the original button was and where the new button is doesn't seem to work with the shadow. So what I'm going to do is, with my button layer selected, I'm going to add a layer mask, black as my foreground color. I just want to clean it up. Okay, so I'm just going to go around and remove the edges. I'll bring my hardness up to 40% again. So again, I'm going to get a good match. Now, if you wanted to, you could trace around the button and cut it out properly, but this way also works. And I think it's just as accurate. Okay. I'm going to get rid of the shadow because I'm going to show you another way to bring a realistic shadow in if that wasn't an option for you. So there it is there. I've just got the button on its own without any fabric. So you can see before and after, but it kind of looks like it's just floating there. It does need that a shadow underneath. So to add a shadow, and just let me show you what the other shadow look like. So the original button has a shadow running underneath. So the light that's coming from the top is causing that little shadow. So that's what we want to match. So I come back to my new button layer. The layer selected, right click and you'll get a little drop down menu. I'm going to hit this first one, blending options. Now you'll get a new little dialog box that comes up. So looking down here at the left hand side of the screen, we're going to come all the way down to the bottom and we're going to select drop shadow. And if you once you've selected that, if you want to see the dialog box, just click on that word drop shadow and you'll have this drop shadow dialog box. So if you don't see it, make sure that you've got that highlighted by clicking on it. Okay, so have a look at this. Already the default one is looking pretty good. Now you've got a couple of blending options for this. For clothes, I suggest you stick with multiply as a blending option because that actually makes the shadow blend into the fabric and really stick. It looks super realistic. The opacity slider controls how light or dark your shadow is. So all the way to 100%, super dark shadow. And if you've got very soft light that you want to blend, you want to lower opacity. But I want to make sure that I'm matching my original shadow. So I'm going to go with somewhere about 50%. That looks pretty good. Now, you've got the distance. You've got the angle of the shadow. So at the moment, I've got the light coming from the top down and the shadows being cast underneath. Let's say I was lighting from the other way, then that's going to cause a shadow over there. Or if I wanted to bring the shadow over to the right, camera right, I move the angle over there and camera left over there. So let's go back to our original shadow, something like that. That looks pretty good. Now the distance is how far the shadow is away from your item. So like you can completely detach it, which is ridiculous. But anyway, you can just have a bit of fun moving shadows. So I just want it to be around there. That looks pretty good to me. The spread is how wide your shadow spreads out, and it also controls the hardness of the shadow. So I just want to contain the spread a little bit. About there looks good. And then the size, you can make it a really soft, nothing shadow or something like that. That looks pretty close to the original. And another thing that you want to do is, because you're creating another layer with pixels on top of your original layer, you want to make sure that you add a little bit of noise to the image to make it look a little bit more realistic. Too much noise doesn't look great. Usually 1 to 3% looks really good. So somewhere around there looks great, and hit OK. So here is our new shadow, complete with a little drop shadow, the button with the drop shadow. So let me just show you the original. Okay, look at that. That's a pretty good match, I reckon. So that's the original, that's the new one. So there we go. So we've now moved the jacket, cleaned up the edges, and everything is looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with how all of that looks. Let me just show you before and after. And now finally, one last thing that I want to do is I'm going to put a curves adjustment layer over the whole lot. So I'm going to go with the default preset of darker, and that's looking pretty good. I don't want to darken the entire image. I just want to darken a selection. So now that I've added that adjustment layer over the top, I'm going to invert it, Command I. All right, now I'm going to get my white brush, nice big brush. Okay, I'm using the bracket keys to make my brush smaller and larger. So that's also another little shortcut. And make sure my brush is 0 hardness. And I'm just going to come in and just brush on a little bit of darkness, just to blend it all in and make it all look a lot more realistic. And there we go. So we started with this, and we finished with that. Lots of different applications that you can use that for. So yeah, go ahead, test it out. Hope you enjoy it.